Okay, so welcome everyone. I am Karin Gutman, founder of Spirit of Story, and I have here with us Samantha Dunn. So let me introduce you to her. She is an author and a journalist. She's a writing teacher, and this is my favorite part. She calls herself an advocate for storytellers everywhere. Hear, hear. Her novel, Failing Paris, was a finalist for the Penn West Fiction Award, and she is also published the best-selling memoir Not by Accident, as well as Faith and Carlos Gomez, and is a widely published essayist and journalist. She's currently the senior editor of premium content produced for the 11 newspapers of the Southern California News Group. She also produces the Bookish program for the news group, which is co-hosted by Sandra Singh Low, which profiles authors and celebrities. And she lives in Orange County, which is not too far from Los Angeles, with her son and her husband, and apparently a menagerie of furry creatures. Yes.
Yes, quite a few. My husband, I think, has an animal hoarding problem because he's the kind of guy who comes home and says, "Honey, can we get the donkey? Can we please get a donkey?" I mean, what are
And
you
you
gonna?
and you say,
What the hell? Just put him in the back. We have a pet. We live in an equestrian community, so that's possible. But yeah, he literally came home and said, "Honey, can we get a donkey?"
I think that's amazing. I think I saw a video of a pig.
Yes, the pig, alas, has gone. He's crossed the Rainbow Bridge now, but yes,
Oh.
the pig arrived at the house the same way.
Mm.
Yeah.
So Sam, I am excited for this conversation because what we're going to talk here about is what it means to really be a writer, over
Over.
like the years, right? Like what it means to live the writing life, what it means to like how we define success, how we just show up as writers on the day to day and keep it going. So, it's easy to focus on like the latest book, and which is often the inspiration for conversations, of course, to celebrate that. And then there's this. I think even Danny Shapiro wrote a whole book on still writing. Isn't that what it was called?
Right. Yes.
It was worthy of a whole book and certainly a whole conversation just devoted to this topic. So I think maybe to start, it would be helpful if you wouldn't mind just kind of giving like a thumbnail kind of overview of your journey as a writer for some context.
Sure. Well, as I was saying this to you yesterday in our pre-conversation, it's important to understand that I didn't think that anybody like me could be a writer initially in my life. I was, from a very blue collar. I am from a very blue collar background, very blue collar family, raised by my mother and my grandmother, my single mother and my grandmother. And we lived in a trailer in a rural part of New Mexico. Nobody was a writer. Nobody alive was a writer. Writers were only dead guys or guys who went to boarding school in Connecticut. You know what I mean? Nobody I could see or touch or feel. But that's not to say books weren't hugely important in our home. We had stacks of paperbacks along the walls like a fortress, they were inculcating us against ignorance. Sometimes I think I wanted to be a writer because it would get my mom's attention. I mean, books were
Mm,
central to our existence, even though we didn't have any money
mm,
uh, or any formal real education. My mom had she was a nurse, but she had never had any academic training beyond that. Anyhow, but what we did have were newspapers. And
mm,
what we did have were friends who were journalists, who were women who were journalists. And that's something that I could imagine and I could embrace and I could access. And so even starting, of course I was involved in my high school newspaper and then my local community newspaper. I wrote a column called Round Robertson, our high school, you know, gossip column for the local newspaper,
nice.
and got involved in radio and all of those things that were available to me. And so that was the course I studied in college as well. Got a degree in journalism, worked at the college newspaper, worked at the college radio station. And then it wasn't until I came to Los Angeles a few years after I graduated that this really happened. This was really the moment, you guys. I was driving down the road on the 101 freeway, going to my crappy job in Van Nuys at a trade magazine publishing house, because strangely, the Los Angeles Times was not waiting for me to arrive in Los Angeles.
Go figure.
Go figure. I thought that they would welcome me with open arms, but they didn't get the memo. Anyhow, I was driving down the 101, going to my crappy job, and I heard on NPR the writer Kate Braverman being interviewed. And some of you might know Kate Braverman, or some of you who know me have certainly heard me talk about Kate Braverman. But she was a force of nature, certainly a linchpin of the Los Angeles literary community in the 80s and the 90s. To say she had a big personality is a gross understatement. But anyhow, I heard her talking about writing in terms of rock and roll, that she wanted to reach people the way Jim Morrison reached people. She wanted to have the driving pulse of Led Zeppelin in her prose. And I thought, I literally pulled over on the side of the road while I was listening to this, and it gave me a certain permission. It gave me a certain accessibility. It let me, this woman talking about rock and roll, let me enter it in a way that I couldn't have imagined before. Anyway, long story short, ended up getting in her private writing workshop. Was there in this environment for a number of years, and a lot of us came out of that workshop. Janet Fitch came out of that workshop, Christina Garcia, Maria Escandon, Mary Rako, Les Plesko, Joshua John Miller. I mean, all of us. It was a thing. And from there, I published my first novel, as you mentioned, Failing Paris, which is really a work of autofiction. I didn't have a word for it then, but that's what it is. It's fiction, but very, very closely hewn to my own experience. And that set me on a new path. I still worked for magazines, but I was working full-time as a writer and a book editor. And I went through, and Karin, I was telling you this yesterday, I went through this period in my life that I thought was going to continue forever. I just said something and I got a book contract, right? I mean, I couldn't not get published at a certain time in my career. I was
like
getting
Midas touch.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, I had the hubris to think it would go on forever. I wasn't burning up the New York Times bestseller list, but I was definitely part of the conversation, certainly in Los Angeles. I also was a writer in residence at the New York State Summer Writers Institute for almost a decade, which is, if you don't know about it, look it up. It was like being a, at the feet of the gods at Mount Olympus is what it was like. It was incredible just to have dinner. Faculty dinners included Joyce Carol Oates, Russell Banks, William Kennedy,
Oh my gosh.
Rick Moody, Amy Hempel. I mean, these were the people you just had dinner with every night.
And just in the course of you growing as a writer, you just applied? I mean, how did you?
I did. I had not, I was almost finished with Failing Paris. And I applied to be a student there. And that first year I was a student. Paul Harding was my next door neighbor in the dorm room. I mean, we used to get drunk it was crazy. It was an amazing time. And then the next year I was invited back as a writer. Actually, no. And the next year I was invited back as an assistant to James Miller, who was their nonfiction instructor. Had published Failing Paris by that time. Then I had a terrible horseback riding accident, which is integral to my life, which is the subject of Not by Accident, Reconstructing a Careless Life. Came back on crutches the next year and started writing under, with the encouragement of Philip Lopate and a few of the other people there, started writing my first memoir, which was by accident. And then from there, I became a writer in residence, and I was a writer in residence there for 7 years. So I did, that's what I was doing for my entire 30s, essentially. And then, dun, 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 I made the mistake of falling in love. What happens to us and getting married.
How dare you?
I know, right? So I get married to a political operative and moved to Orange County. Complicated story. But even more complicating for my career is that at the age of 41, as I was telling you yesterday, at the age of 41, I go in to have a hysterectomy. This is a true story. I'm not a novelist. Well, I am a novelist, but I'm not making this up. I go in to have a hysterectomy and find out I'm pregnant at the age of 41. So my career and my life takes a dramatic turn, and I have a son. Actually, Leslie was I just have to call out Leslie. She was a huge support during that time because I was like, what the I have no plan for motherhood anyway. But that really changed my trajectory as a writer. It put the brakes, it put the brakes on a lot of things. We moved to Northern California for a short time. My husband was working for the Schwarzenegger administration. And I was working on a book that seemingly no one was interested in. And that really made me, I mean, that I think is crucial to this conversation now. That made me really question what it meant to be a writer. If I'm no longer publishing, if I'm no longer, flying out, jet setting out to New York every few months to do a reading or hang out with famous people, then what does it mean? You know?
Mhm,
And then that was really humbling for me.
mhm,
And it really led me to deepen my relationship with what I needed out of writing
hmm.
for myself, you know, for
Which
my,
was,
well, from writing is the way that I understand my place in the world. First and foremost, it's not about getting other people to read it. It's about my own sense of what it means to be human. And
mm,
I really deeply mean that. And beyond that, I started teaching a great deal. And I found that being of service to other writers, helping them materialize their own stories in the world, understanding themselves, like understanding the story the world told them about who they are, and understanding who they are really, that was a narcotic I didn't anticipate.
mm,
That is one of the most rewarding elements, being of service, and I'm not just bullshitting here, it's really true. Being of service in the writing community has been probably the greatest joy of my life. And
mm,
it's altered my own expectation of what I do on the page.
mm,
So to make money, to keep a roof over my head, because being a freelance writer and editor is kind of like being a professional gambler or a gunslinger or both. You're up, you win big, and you're down for a long time, and you're up and you win big. And doing that with a 3-year-old was challenging, shall we say. So I
mhm,
got an offer to come back into the newspaper world. And I did. And I came back in 2013 and I haven't left. That's what I do as my primary day job. And I also teach, as we've said, I teach at Chapman University. I have a private writing workshop and I teach in different programs, specifically writing by writers with Pam Houston. So that's what I'm doing. And
mhm,
that's the journey. So
mhm.
hopefully that gives you an overview.
It does give an overview. So there's so much to really talk about based on kind of your own journey here. I mean, so I'm interested kind of in that, just to start that shift, like, oh, and then drum roll, you know, how would, I mean, what's your perspective on that now? I mean, you point to, okay, you had, you fell in love, you had a family, but you're also talking about a book you were working on that wasn't,
Eh,
that wasn't sort of catching interest. Um,
Right.
do we need to combine those, or can we separate those out and to kind of look at them individually? Because I think they're
That is
two separate things.
That is, I think they overlap, but let's separate them out for a moment. And
Okay.
because I think, at one time, this is again, no exaggeration. My mother, picture the cigarette in her fingers, one was always there. She goes, maybe the purpose of your life is to serve as a warning to others. And I, I tell people that
Wow.
all the time because sometimes it feels that way. Listen, on the heels of Not by Accident, which was commercially somewhat successful and critically successful, was Failing Paris. I had an anthology that I edited, but anthologies aren't big books usually. Then I had another book called Faith in Carlos Gomez that my editor in New York asked me to write. Thought it was going to be a big summer book. And the marketing department at Henry Holt, for whatever reason, just didn't buy into it. They didn't even put it in hardcover. They put it straight to paperback, which some of you might know it used to be that that was the kiss of death because it wouldn't be reviewed critically. It wouldn't be
Mm,
taken as a serious book.
mm,
Um, and that's when things started to kind of unravel in terms of my Midas touch.
mm,
Um, the book didn't do anything in terms of book sales. It did get picked up by Hollywood, and it had a whole trajectory there, which was interesting and quite edifying in some ways, but
mm,
ultimately was never made, or hasn't,
mhm,
I should say, hasn't been
mhm,
made.
mhm,
Um,
mhm. Was that a lucrative path to go down, the Hollywood path?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, who think of all the writers in history who come to Hollywood just to cash in. I mean, there are
Mhm,
lots of big paychecks.
mhm.
Very few things actually get made,
Right.
unless you're my friend Cheryl Strayed, and then everything you do gets made. That's separate.
A
That's
never ending Midas touch. Okay. So,
that's a separate conversation. But I had this idea for a book. It's called Trailer Trash: An American Story. And it was based, of course, in growing up the way I grew up, but also the conversation around why do we vilify mobile homes in American culture? Why is that the symbol of systemic poverty and low class? Certainly, not uniquely among whites, but it's often associated with the poor white uh, trajectory. And and anyway, so that was going to, my agent at the time thought that was going to be my big book. That was going to be my breakout book. That was going to be my
mm,
nickel and dime. That was going to be a huge success. So I did a proposal and nothing happened.
like crickets.
I didn't get I was represented at that time by Peter Mattson at Sterling Lord Literistic, which is like every writer's wet dream of what having an agent is. You know, he takes you to Baltazar's in New York for a 4-hour lunch. You know, he's the kind of agent who speaks in that somewhat mid-Atlantic accent, has the beautiful, Greenwich Village view out of his office. Um, he's the kind of agent who picks up the phone and he knows 6 editors, and those 6 editors usually take what he offers. But they didn't get the whole poor white thing. They didn't get the whole trailer thing. How could that be of interest to people?
Mm,
Um, so he said, put that on ice or make it a novel. And I was furious about it. I just couldn't, I didn't want to make it a novel. I didn't want to change the idea of the book. Um, so anyway, long story short, I left my big
mm,
time agent,
wow.
um, which might not have been a great thing in retrospect, but whatever. It just felt like it was time to reimagine myself.
Mm,
And then I landed with another agent who is wonderful, and I'm still with her. She's a smaller boutique agent, Lynn Jones Johnston, who specializes in nonfiction. And she said, right, this is absolutely going to be a big book. We're going to send it out again. She sent it out again. No offers this time. And then I really lost my confidence.
mm,
I really lost the idea of, wow, maybe I don't understand what a story is. And I
mm,
went into a spiral of self-doubt. And
mm,
I listened to the agent. I made some changes on the proposal that in retrospect, I really didn't believe in, but I did it because she
mm,
was so confident in it. And I see some of you, Leslie, I see you nodding. I mean, it's very easy to do that when you're making a living, when you're paying your bills with your writing. It's easy to get caught up in the fear of what you need to do in order to sustain your existence. Um,
I just to back up one like beat
Sure.
with the Carlos Gomez memoir, you said that you were asked to write it. So
Yeah.
at some point, is there a diversion, like a moving away from kind of what's authentically coming from you and moving into this other space? Or I mean, I even heard you say by not by accident, it was recommended that you write about it, but you weren't told by an agent to write that memoir.
Well, not per se. I had just never written memoir before. I keep
Mhm.
in mind I'm trained as a journalist, and the worst thing you can do is write in the first person as a journalist, right? Or it used to be.
It's changing, right?
Those paradigms have shifted considerably. But at the time, the thought that my own story could take center stage was not something that I even considered. Um, but then I the first memoir I ever read was Angela's Ashes by Frank.
Mm. Mhm.
Some of you might know that book. It was a huge success in the 90s. And it was transformative to me
Mm.
because not only did I recognize, oh, that's not just my family, it's a cultural condition, which was a revelation to me, but it also gave me the experience of how powerful one person's honest story could be, how transformative, how that speaks directly into your own life when it's told honestly and without pretense. So those factors combined, and I was excited then to write Not by Accident as my own story.
Mhm.
Folding in research that I had done about what it meant to be accident prone. That's actually what I think that's certainly the formula that is most interesting to me in memoir,
Mm.
when it's not only your own story, but when your own story is in conversation with a larger question. Like Leslie, if you guys haven't read Leslie Lair's A Boob's Life, please read it. It's one of the most innovative,
Mm.
edifying memoirs there is, but Leslie does that to great effect. And I love when our stories are put against a larger cultural or
I
uh,
second that. Mhm.
political story. Anyway, I'm sorry.
So no, no, no. Well, I mean, I'm going to kind of come back to my original question because I was asking you a couple things, but did you see that you were moving away from kind of what was authentically yours when your agent said, write the Carlos Gomez memoir? Did you start to move in a different direction?
Actually, no, it ended up being Carlos Gomez was something I'm still very proud of that book. It's long out of print and it's very difficult to find now, but it ultimately took me on a path of self-discovery that I really needed. And I really felt that I grew and the writing is authentically me. But where I started to get off track was on trailer trash,
Got it.
on trying to pitch that proposal in a way that would somehow hit a zeitgeist, and that never works, because if you're writing to the zeitgeist now, what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years when the book comes out
Mhm.
is it's not going to be relevant anymore. So uh, so yeah, that was where I made, if you will, my fatal error. Uh,
Mhm.
but
So what would you have done differently? I mean, looking back, I'm
I,
focusing on this period of time because it seems like a
yeah,
big shift how that
yeah,
happened.
it was a huge shift. I would have stuck to my guns and just said, I don't care what the market says. I'm just going to write the book that I want to write,
Mm.
and then found an audience for it, because I've written large chunks of that work. And when I read it and when I publish sections from it, people say, "Oh my God, I love this is fantastic. This is some of the best work you've done."
Mm.
But the thing won't come together. Actually, flashing forward, I've actually given up on that concept of a book. And I'm just picking through the bones now and publishing parts of it as essays, because I began that book in the early aughts, and who I was then when I began the book and where we were as a culture is much, much different than it is now. So
Mm.
still think that material is relevant, but I don't feel, I think you do grow beyond your books sometimes, right?
Mm.
I think I see it in my own students. Some people come in and they've hoarded this manuscript for 30 years and they want to make this manuscript work. And what I tell them is, bless this manuscript, thank this manuscript. This manuscript kept you alive probably,
Mhm. Mhm.
but it has served its purpose. It doesn't have a role as a book in the world. It has some other meaning for it. That's not to say some parts of it can't be used, but as you conceived of it initially, its lifespan is over. So you have to start with a blank page and reimagine the book. And that's where I am with my own writing. I've had some work and some health issues come up that have taken me off the idea of writing a book right now. But I imagine I will return to it because, like I said at the beginning of the conversation, that's how I understand myself. It kind of doesn't matter to me. And publishing itself has changed. I'm sure you guys have talked about this. Publishing, the idea of publishing has changed a lot. Not to say that people still aren't making hundreds of thousands of dollars with advances and doing that kind of thing, but that's more rare than it is common, and even not necessary anymore to find yourself in the conversation around books. Everything's changed. Everything.
I want to talk about that too. But I want to maybe also just talk about first this shift towards like having a life, and getting married and having, a family, and how that kind of shift also can inform and affect, you know, who you are as a writer. Um, do you have just out the gate anything to say about that?
So funny when in the salad days of when we were first married, I would say very dramatically to my husband, "You ruined me. Now I'm happy. I can't." Well, of course, just wait around, right? In real life, it will come up and hit you in the ass again. But in all seriousness, I had never really been in a partnership before. I had never been made a home before. I was married before, but my ex-husband and I, first of all, we were very young. We were both incredibly ambitious, in Hollywood. He was a producer and uh, sound designer for television and music. And we were just, you know, how should I say this? You know that song by the Eagles, Life in the Fast Lane? You know,
Mhm.
I was listening to that song at one point in the 90s, and I thought, man, when the Eagles start to talk about your life, you've been in LA too long. Let's just say we were not cooking dinner and watching television together. It was more like we were married, but it was more like dating somebody really hot for a few years until
Got
they're
it. Got it.
right, until they went to rehab, basically. And then I met my husband, who has a family, I have stepkids. He already had children. And suddenly we were involved in each other's life in a way that I had never been involved in someone's life before. We were making a home together. And that was a different experience for me altogether. The vast swaths of solitude that I had relied on for my work were no longer there. There was more, there was more engagement. There was more breaking up of time. There was more expectation that we would share things. Imagine we would share things. Uh,
Mm.
and it did shift for me.
Mhm.
I did have to find a new equilibrium for my own writing, because I had relied for many years on being single or alone and able to write. I wrote like an addict. And what I mean by that is
Mm.
I would, just mess around for a while and then let the idea percolate. And then as I got more intimate with my topic, more convinced of it, more in the thrall of it, I would start to spend more and more and more and more
Mhm.
time
Mhm.
until I was sleeping with my laptop
Mhm.
and finishing books that way and finishing articles. It was just
Mhm.
this kind of creative um, dream in a lot of ways. And having a home and having, surprise, a child just completely disrupted that.
Mhm.
And I'd have to write in short bursts in the car as I was waiting to pick up my son from preschool,
Mhm.
Now I'm waiting for my son for basketball practice,
Mhm, mhm.
It's gone that kind of rhythm has kept up all of these years now.
And so did it change how you wrote? Did it change your voice? Did it change, or is it merely like, oh, I just have to sort of reorganize my time and how and when I write?
Uh, reorganize my time, how and when I write, but it also does change what you consider important.
Mhm,
Um, I went from a more solipsistic view, only concerned with myself, to a broader lens of how we connect and how the story connects for other people. Um,
mhm,
and that's an interesting question. Does your voice change? I used to argue that your voice really never changed. Because it's the imprint of your consciousness. Josh Moore, the writer Josh Moore, model citizen, always does that. When he lectures, he always starts with this conversation. Look at your thumb. Your voice is as unique as your fingerprint, right? And he's right. Your voice is as unique as your fingerprint, but just like your fingerprint, over time, it gets worn, it changes somewhat
mhm.
over the course of the difficulty of living. So I do think your voice does deepen and does shift. You go.
Well, it sounds like it, and the way you're describing it, like to, have a deeper understanding of yourself and relationship to the world and a deepening sense of, what matters. I mean, all of that I would imagine ultimately you can shift your voice and how you're writing.
That I often have people come into my workshops who are regretful of the fact that they've just started writing later in their life,
Mm.
50. And I think, no, this is the perfect time to start writing. You've really got something to say. You've really got some context. You've really got some perspective. You've got some wisdom and you've got some humility. Because let me tell you, when I was a 28-year-old hotshot, I was a fucking asshole. Sorry. That's the technical term. But yeah, I
Mhm.
was.
Well,
Anyway,
it's also interesting that as you're getting, like, you're having this crisis of confidence, you're also deepening your voice as a writer, or as a human in the world, that they're both happening at the same time. And
that's true.
so so what have you discovered then, on this side of things where, your life takes on a different, I guess, paradigm, so to speak, and you are making money in a different, you're still in the literary world, but you're not making money off of your, I don't
Books.
know, books. Yeah.
What have I discovered? I think it circles back to that idea of service. That if we aren't connecting, if we aren't somehow helping people connect to themselves, if my writing and my work isn't somehow helping people connect to themselves, if it's not bringing some insight or isn't adding something to the world, if it's just taking away by indulging in misery porn, it's just not interesting. It's not doing its job. I mean, there might be a place for that. And I see my 19-year-old students discovering their pain for the first time, which I think is right on track for their age. But if you're, and if you're, I don't know, I hate to bag on Klaus and Nausgaard, but come on, if you're if you're in your 50s talking about your uh, whatever, I'm not articulating this well, but I think if you can broaden and deepen your work to the idea of service, that what you're saying matters in a larger context for people's lives, not only for your own but for other people. I think that's what matters. At least that's what's mattering for me.
And how are you balancing then? Because you have a business, I mean, you're servicing what, 11 different news publications now with what you do. And I'm imagining you're managing lots of people. Yes, you have got,
I'm managing lots of freelancers. Local news now is kind of a game of smoke and mirrors. There are very few of us doing a lot of things. How do I manage it? I
I
don't
mean,
know.
meaning how do you manage that, and sort of like kind of back to our essential question, you as a writer, your work as a writer, you discovering now where that lives in you, and how you honor that. So how are you doing that now? You're raising a
Yeah,
son who's 15, you're sort of managing sort of a big literary, you know, outlets. with what you're managing on a day to day. So where does writing live then? Your own writing.
It lives in small pockets of time for me. It lives in essays, it lives in short stories, it lives in pockets that I've got a piece coming out in El Palacio magazine this summer. That's a project that I did. I had a small essay come out in Francesca Leah Bloch's literary magazine, Lit Angels. Those small pieces, that's where it lives. That's where my own work exists for me. I also, frankly, can write an article, can write an essay any damn time I want to for the Southern California News Group. And I do that periodically when
Hmm.
I really deeply have something to say. I did something about hearing loss. I wear hearing aids now. And
Hmm.
I did, it's a very intimate thing to reveal to people that you have a hearing loss. And I realized by sharing that story, I would be giving other people license to share their story. So that for me is where it's living now. And not to
Hmm.
say that it's not a bigger idea isn't perhaps percolating,
Hmm.
but that's where my own writing exists. But my entire life is writing, understand.
Right.
My entire life is helping people get published, publishing, talking about other writers, being in the conversation that I think is so transformative to anyone who's willing to engage in it and willing to listen to it.
So, I mean, I kind of want to also just talk about that aspect of helping other writers and what is your perspective when you're working with, in your writing group with other writers is like how do you guide them in terms of the, I guess, how important is publishing? How important is the process of, of, of just getting out what you need to get out on the page? Like how do you work with writers and how do you guide them?
There are a few writers here that could probably answer that question better than I can because they've worked with me for a while. But first of all, I'm not the kind of writer or not the kind of instructor who ever says publishing doesn't matter. I think publishing matters a whole lot because
Mm,
we're not writing a diary. Our diaries are for our journals, and our diaries are for our own process, for our own um, self-understanding. But if you're plopping down money for a writing workshop and you're forming essays and short stories and working on a book, you're not just doing it for yourself. Even if you're doing it for your family, if the audience is no larger than your family, you're still doing this to communicate to others. I think sometimes, it often, I've said this before many times, but it often feels like it's a message in a bottle. You write something and then you toss it out and you don't know where it's going to land or if it's going to land, but trust me, it is going to land. It's
mm,
going to land somewhere. People that you will probably never meet will read your words, especially in
mhm,
the age of the internet. That's the amazing thing about publishing online. You have no freaking idea who's reading your stuff, really. I mean, sometimes you get feedback, but you have no idea where your words live in other people's hearts. And I think it's important to acknowledge that you're not just writing for yourself. You're writing to be in a conversation that is beyond you
mm.
and that will extend and that will outlive you. Let me tell you something really it reminded me of this because every once in a while, okay, I just have to be honest. Lots of my friends are
Please.
lots of my
Oh,
friends are famous. Lots of my friends are famous writers. I mean, I'm not just talking about acquaintances. My 3 a.m. friends that I've known for years, they're bestsellers. They're people who you have on your bookshelf, right? And sometimes I go, why isn't that me? People have said to me, why aren't you more famous? I'm like, motherfucker, I would like to know that myself. Um, but I was riding, I'm dropping a famous name here. I was on vacation with my friend Pam Houston this summer. We went to a ranch she was teaching and I was just riding horses for all day. And I was riding alongside this woman and she didn't know me and I didn't really know her. And we were chit-chatting and somehow it came up that I'd had a bad horseback riding accident. She said, "Oh, you have to read this book about this woman who
no,
her
it
leg
was your
almost,
book.
It was my book. She was talking,
Oh.
I laughed. I said, "I
So
wrote that book," and she said, "No." Oh my, she said, "I'm so embarrassed. I didn't know who you were." I'm like, "Honey, it's totally fine. No one knows who I am anymore." And 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 she told me that she was a middle school teacher, and she for years she'd had students read that book.
wow, that's
I had
amazing.
no idea of it. No idea.
But what's the difference for you? I mean, this idea of like, why aren't I more famous? Like, what's where does
Oh,
that live for you? Like, how is
oh,
their life different? How is Pam Houston's? I mean,
oh, I mean, it's just,
so different.
listen, we all have our ego. I think it's ridiculous that ego rears its head in me sometimes. It's just freaking ridiculous because how is their life different? Listen, being a famous writer in America, let me just give you some images that I think of about being a famous writer in America. And remember I talked about the New York State Summer Writers Institute and that dinner with all
Hmm.
the faculty? I remember
Hmm.
walking down the streets of Saratoga Springs, Jim Miller on one side, Lee K. Abbott on the other side, two very well-known writers. And in front of us was this mob of writers walking. There was Joyce Carol Oates, there was William Kennedy, there was Marilyn Robinson, there was Amy Hempel, there was Mary Gateskill. Who else was there? Well, you get the idea. Russell Banks was probably there too, and somebody, Rick Moody. Nobody was following them. There was no paparazzi. You know what I'm saying? There was nothing. Nobody cared. That's what it means. If a bomb
Right.
had gone off right then, the American literati would have been decimated.
Hmm.
Nobody knew. I was years ago, I was covering the opening because I did a lot of writing for swanky magazines back in, especially in the 90s. I was covering the opening of The English Patient in Westwood, and it was, Courtney Love was there, Sidney Pollack, Harrison Ford. I mean, it was like a wax museum of famous people. And in the corner, standing by himself in an oversized tuxedo, was Michael Ondance, who I knew Michael, who wrote, of course, The English Patient. He's standing there with his drink. And I walked over to him and I said, "Michael." And he said, "Oh, say," he was so happy that somebody knew who he was. The reason for the season, and nobody had a freaking clue, right? That's what it means. I mean,
I mean, is it that they get to, make money and they get to make a living? Is that like bottom line? Like these,
that's part of it. Yeah. I mean, and even that living that you think isn't that extravagant, but yeah, it's also being a Jeopardy question, It's also that sense of being in the cultural zeitgeist in a way that
right,
will resonate. I think that's maybe the biggest thing. But no, I mean, they still struggle the same way when they sit down. When we sit
right,
down to write, we're all equal. We're
right.
all
That's
we all struggle.
we're all facing the blank page.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, I just want to touch on too the like just the changes that have happened in publishing and how that's affecting writers. I mean, from journalism to, I mean, at the same time, opportunities are opening up. They're also kind
Right.
of uh, limit, becoming more limited. So, I mean, how has that affected your kind of how you think about your own writing
Well,
and publishing?
it used to be publishing had one paradigm, at least in my head. The self-publishing was anathema to what it meant to have a real writing career, for
Right.
instance, right? Any kind of publishing model beyond getting a contract was with what was then the big eight, now is the big four. And having your agent take you to lunch at Baltazar's and having the book tour. If that it wasn't that, then you weren't a real writer. Well, we know now that that is hooey. Yeah, Leslie's like, get out of here with that. It doesn't exist. First of all, it doesn't exist it exists for about 1%. That whole scenario that I just mentioned exists for about maybe 1% of writers at this point. Everybody, no matter who you are, is doing it DIY now. And certainly with people like, let's just say her name, Colleen Hoover, blowing down the doors of what the differentiation between traditional publishing and self-publishing, um, and I don't even know how to say this, and the potential for reaching audiences via social media, specifically book talk, TikTok. It's just changed everything. You can get as much traction now with a self-published or independently published book as you can with a major. Not always, but the potential is there. So really, I mean, there are kind of no rules. But by the same token, that also means that that traditional trajectory where you'd get an advance for your book, maybe modest, maybe extravagant, but you'd get some money to live as a writer.
Mhm.
That that has gone away.
Mhm. So if you
Now
were
we're all entrepreneurs at this point.
so if you were to publish another book, would you go that route?
Would I go
The
self-publish? I probably wouldn't self-publish. I still have an agent. I still have that body of work behind me, but I
Mhm.
would certainly go for a smaller press than I would consider previously. It used to be there was such snobbery in publishing, you guys. There was, in terms of literary fiction, Knopf was at the top of the hill, FSG, and then you kind of went down the road, from there. And people would say, "Oh, so and so is not well published," or you were with a certain publisher, you would certainly not be considered for the National Book Award. That kind of shit, really.
Mhm.
And I just think less and less is that true now. So I don't
Mhm.
know. I mean, when I have another book, will I go with a smaller publisher? Almost certainly.
Mhm.
Almost certainly the smaller publisher would be someone who would still consider me as viable and my work as viable.
And as you say, you're focusing on publishing essays. Do you feel like it's important to be compensated as a writer? Or when you're publishing
Yes.
your pieces, are you always being compensated?
Not always, but if I'm seriously putting elbow grease into a piece, I expect to be compensated at some point. Listen, back in olden times, I would get $6 a word from Oprah magazine for a piece. That is much as a book contract from. Can you hear my dog? She's complaining. Can you hear?
No, we're
Be
good.
quiet. Um, but I mean, even as an editor, I feel it's important to pay writers. There needs to be some form of remuneration. There needs to be some form of energy exchange, because when we start saying everything's free, it means that art has no value. That
Mhm.
how we value intellectuals and how we value artists, it's already crappy. But if we start just writing for free, I think that can be problematic.
But I mean, even $100 for like a
And
well-written.
$100, something symbolic, right?
Okay.
But
So
something.
I see.
Yeah. I think it is. I mean, not always. And sometimes that just isn't an option, right? If it's a particular passion project, uh, Cal Arts used to have a beautiful, actually, no, they used to have a beautiful literary magazine called Black Clock. And I was going to say you weren't remunerated for that, but I think you were. I think you got like $50 as some kind of token for your energy. But it wasn't much. It was really just token.
Mhm. Mhm. And I kind of want to glean some more of your insights around memoir in particular, because of course this is like largely the audience that I'm
Sure.
working with as writers. And is that where you're focusing your energies, like as a writer? I know you're or
Yes. Yes. It is. I think I mentioned to you that I found after writing memoir that it is incredibly transformative, not only for you, the writer, to understand your own story and to seize the narrative, right? To seize the means of production, but the way it resonates inside the reader's heart not to listen, fiction is incredible. Certainly we have loved and been transformed by novels throughout time, but there's something about memoir. There's something about that person walking the tightrope without a net that makes us take it on board in a different way. I can't tell you the number of people who have said certainly that my own story mattered to them in a way that they felt was almost their story at a certain level. But working with writers, and I'm sure you feel, Karin, I'm sure you feel this working with writers day in and day out, the satisfaction you get seeing someone arrive at their own story and the way that that resonates is like nothing else.
Yeah,
So yes,
100%.
long story short, memoir is what memoir and personal essay, personal narrative is what I'm concentrating my energies on.
And I mean, it seems to be like just continuing to evolve the memoir space. Like it's not sort of that like a trend, but like
No,
continues to.
God, it is so. Listen, I got so pissed off one time years ago when I was taught at UCLA for a number of years, and there was something. It was a 4-day retreat called the. Oh God, we're almost out of time. Sorry, I'll make this quick.
No, it's okay. Okay.
There's something called the writer's studio where you uh, it was an intensive for 4 days, and at the end there was a reception, and this guy comes up to me at the reception. He'd been in the screenwriting class, of course. He goes, "So you're the memoir teacher, right?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Isn't that just a bunch of old hens talking about their problems?"
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love to see your faces
Mm-hmm.
at the galleries. Can you believe that shit? Can
Yeah.
you believe that?
Well, it's
I-
I mean, it's being turned on its head by from
It's
it's like the yeah, like Melissa Phoebus's book,
well,
Body Work. Have you read that one?
yes, I
I mean,
remember
it's just like
Melissa.
the language around memoir is just completely
It's
re.
completely shifted. And when we look at the time that people have actually been telling their own stories, this is the course of human literature, right? This is the course of time that women in particular, women, queer, anybody marginalized has been allowed to tell their own story in their own words. This big. So there is we're just now in the renaissance, if you will,
Mm,
of the idea of personal
I love
narrative.
that. I
And
love
who
that.
knows where that's gonna lead us. Yeah, Jeff, you are not an old hen. Rooster,
You are
perhaps,
not
but
an old hen,
maybe
Jeff.
not an
That's for
old
sure
hen.
not.
No, look,
Wait, so what
anyway,
did you do? What did you know what you did well or do well? Like if you think back to not by accident, do you know, I mean, where do you go as a writer when you're writing that deeply personal stories? I mean, are there any sort of, I don't know, voices that come up like I can't go there, or do you just naturally kind of sink into the deeply personal? I mean,
no, I don't naturally. I'm from a this was my grandmother. Sorry, as you guessed, because my mouth is filthy, this is from my
it's
family.
okay.
My grandma would say, "It's a dirty bird that shits in its own nest." You never said a word about, everybody could tell what was going on, right? Mom's drunk, passed out at the bar, we're living in a trailer, but you don't talk about it. You don't say it, what the problem is, because that is disloyalty to the nth degree.
So where did you get your permission from then?
I didn't get, I still, listen, I'm still far less loquacious than other writers, but what started to give me permission was the idea that I was talking to one person. I say this to people in my own classes. Imagine you're sitting across the kitchen table. That's that kitchen table space, that's where memoir is written. That is the intimacy that you're dealing with, and you're talking to one person. One person. And you're not talking to yourself, you're not talking to your teacher, you're not talking to your mother, you're talking to one friendly face. I'm talking to you, Karin. I'm talking to you right now across this. I used to
Mhm.
say before I was sober, I used to say, you're at the bar with somebody. But the bar also is problematic for all all of
The
for
obvious reasons.
anyway. But just think the intimacy of the kitchen table,
Hmm.
right?
And do you recommend a particular person or just a single person?
I always had a particular, it's funny that you mentioned that. My books are always written to one particular person, if only because I have a deadline and I need to get get the book done. When I wrote my first book, it was really written to one woman in my writing group who was kind of a snot, and she'd written, I again, people who've taken me know this story, but she'd written this story about Paris and how the French were all so much smarter than we are, and her mummy and daddy were staying at the Georges V, and it was a junior year abroad, and it was completely the opposite of my experience in Paris. And I told her, this isn't how it is. And she was like, well, how is it then, Sam? And so the first line of Failing
Wow.
Paris is still the first line of Failing Paris. It's the line that I wrote is, this is how it is,
Wow.
full
Very
stop.
cool. Mm-hmm.
Um, Not by Accident was written actually to a friend of mine, my friend Mary Rako, an amazing novelist. And then Faith and Carlos Gomez was written to two girlfriends, Rachel Resnick and Julianne Ortali.
Oh, wow.
Because I was actually emailing them I was behind on my deadline, and so I was emailing them pages every day. And
Mm.
that propulsive girlfriend tone influenced the whole book.
Hmm. So last question here, what would you tell your younger self writer? Not the one that was growing up in the trailer park, maybe the one who is
Go into a
start,
fabulous.
yeah, just starting out and sort of getting some traction in LA and
This
you
isn't
know.
all there is. This isn't even the best part of what it is. Keep going.
Mm,
Yeah, that's what I'd say. It isn't even the best part. Keep going.
nice. And what would you tell the self that sent out her proposal, not the one who changed the proposal, but the one who just initially sent out the trailer park proposal, and there's crickets that come back.
This isn't a referendum on who you are as a person or a writer. This is just business. That's what I would tell myself. That's what
Mm.
I understand now.
What would you tell the self that went to go get walked in to get a hysterectomy, the writer self? What would you tell the writer self that walked in to get a hysterectomy and found out she was pregnant?
Oh shit, girl.
And then
And then this is going to enrich your life in a way you can't even imagine. This is going to break open your heart and break open your chest. And so much is going to come in you can't even imagine now.
hmm, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you everybody for joining us today. And Karin, thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for coming, Sam. Happy to have you in my circle.
Yeah, likewise. We got to actually have face-to-face time now. That's
We
the next.
we will.
All right.
Coming down to Orange County.
Okay, you got it. Bye, everybody. Keep writing.
Bye.